So we see proposals for additional spill requirements that would lower the amount of generation coming out of these dams and lower their ability to maybe flex up or down. I don't think we've ever seen anything come out that is giving them more freedom to operate. It's always more and more constrained operation. And so I think that'll be the challenge. Even if it has the same amount of water availability, its availability to run that through the generators may be diminished through other policies that come out.
Welcome back to another episode of DAM, the official podcast of Northwest HydroPower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest RiverPartners. We've been exploring a lot of topics recently that take a broad look at the Northwest clean energy future. But today, we're going to get specific about some hydropower issues as well that we're a bit more familiar with. However, to do that, our guest today is someone that I'm admittedly not quite as familiar with, and that's Steve Edburg, Director of Market Analytics at Energy GPS. By the end of today's discussion, I'm hoping to be a bit more familiar with Steve as well. Steve, you've had a really impressive background and education as well. Tell us a bit about your background and how did your education lead you to your current job of modeling the electric grid?
Sure, man. Thanks, Austin, for having me on. Excited to be here with you today, and happy spring to you. I'm excited for the weather to be turning. So I'm from Spokane, Washington originally, and I went to Washington State University for my college education. And I started in mechanical engineering, went through that program for a bachelor's in mechanical engineering, and then got offered a research assistant position doing computational fluid dynamics studies. And so that's what that is kind of like using a computer model or a computer simulation of a wind tunnel. So kind of a virtual wind tunnel type of study. And so that's kind of when I first got exposed to modeling, was there at WSU and through a master's program. And then I was fortunate enough to get a NSF fellowship to do interdisciplinary study, where we were looking at taking those kind of mechanical engineering fundamental fluid physics principles and applying them to atmospheric fluid flow. And we did, so I did a PhD doing that, where I was looking at airflow within forest canopies. It was for a variety of different applications. One was to try to aid forest managers in combating bark beetle infestations. So the bark beetle has killed similar amount of acres, at least when this was back a while ago now, so my stats might be a little off. I haven't kept up to date with it. But they were killing similar amount of acres as forest fires in the West. And so forest managers could go out and set pheromone traps to try to prevent the outbreaks from occurring. But they didn't have a lot of data on how the pheromones were dispersed within the canopy. So we did modeling, and we actually went in the field and did these tracer gas experiments, where we would release a tracer gas and then measure it downstream to figure out the dilution rates. And we'd go back and try to model it with computer programs. And so that was pretty fascinating, and that's kind of drew me into the modeling work, and I've kind of been sticking with it since. After that work was done and that NSF fellowship was done, I went to the University of Idaho, and I did a postdoc there, where we were looking at, again, it was a bark beetle problem. We were looking at what the impact of the bark beetles were on the carbon cycle across the Western US. And to do that, I went from kind of these really fine scale computational fluid dynamics models, maybe had a footprint of 100 meters or something like that, to then using these global climate models that were developed at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And I was using those to study the impact of these bark beetles across the whole Western US. So it kind of changed scales drastically and got more into the science side of things and away from the engineering side of things. Still doing modeling and still going out in the field and doing field experiments and collecting real world data to compare to the model. So that was really nice. So that was all kind of science and modeling work. I eventually made my way to Sandpoint, Idaho, where I live now. And there was a company here in Sandpoint that was doing energy modeling. And they were using these models called production cost models. And they were the developers of them. It was formed by some senior executives at Portland General who created the model. The model's called Aurora, and then they would come over to Sandpoint to vacation, and they loved it over to Sandpoint. So they eventually moved to office and started an office over here, and it became the headquarters of the company. And that's when I joined that company called Ep.5, and I was helping to create the data sets for the production cost model called Aurora. So that's kind of how long-winded story of how I got into this space.
That's great. Yeah, no, that it's interesting to hear, some of the different issues that you've tackled, all around, and not just having, purely an energy background. As far as your work now and where you're at, tell me a little bit about what Energy GPS is all about, and who does Energy GPS work for as well?
Yeah, sure. So we're a consulting and energy analysis analytical firm that was started in 2009. Our founders are Jeff Richter and Tim Belden, and we have two main aspects. We have a product line where we offer ongoing analysis for different energy problems, and then so it's kind of an up-to-date, ongoing type of product for our clients to use. And then we have a consulting line that does more shorter-term duration projects. So on the product line, we keep up to date daily, even hourly, with gas and power markets across North America and into Europe. And we provide both written reports or news flashes on what's going on, as well as dashboards that our clients can use to stay really up to date with the energy market. So that people that use those products are a big sector of those are traders. So people looking to make either short or long-term trades in the market and understand the market dynamics. And then we also have quite a few developers and utilities and private equity groups that use those tools to stay up to date with the market. And then so that's the product line. On the consulting line, we do spin-off kind of one-off analyses like we did for you guys. So these are shorter duration projects. We do a lot of asset valuation work where clients are looking to either buy or sell an asset and want to know what the value of that is. Sort of our sweet spot is understanding the value as well as the risks associated with the asset. We do long-term fundamental forecasting using our production cost modeling. Part of that is to forecast out energy prices, and part of that is to forecast out capacity market prices, which has been pretty fun lately. And then we do several policy studies. So looking like the work that we did for you guys, where we're looking at the impact of a potential policy that would remove the lower Snake River dams.
I guess, we're obviously, as you mentioned, we're a little bit more familiar with some of that consulting side of Energy GPS and the work that you do there. As far as that side of things goes, what would you say makes the work there stand out? And maybe you could describe to me, on behalf of the listener, what an independent firm like that needs to do to ensure that the work is credible and trustworthy, regardless of maybe who the client is.
Yeah, so I think our analytical ability and our just our reputation and integrity in the marketplace is what sets us apart, for both lines, but in the consulting line especially. So we have through the product line, we've developed a pretty awesome database of all the market fundamentals, and we can leverage that for our forecast work and our consulting work. So we really have a great handle on all the analysis part of it. But we do the work where we do the analysis and we we take what it gives us. We don't necessarily take sides on issues, and we stand behind the work we do and just let the truth speak for itself, or let the analysis speak for itself. And I think that really sets us apart in terms of other shops that may try to swing their results one way or another.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's an important thing to set the stage for in our discussion today, because as we get talking, you guys have done work for us, but you've also done work for a lot of other people around the region, and that work comes really highly respected. And so people might say, oh, well, maybe, RiverPartners, for example, they might be biased towards dams, but when you actually look at the studies and everything, there's respect for it across the board. And I think that it's important to understand, for those that maybe don't know, why that would be the case. So I really appreciate you providing some of that insight. Another thing that I think would be good to set the stage for is if you could maybe describe, as we get, before we get really into this discussion, what is a power cost model, which is one of the models that you've used in your work, and maybe you could describe at a very baseline level how that might work.
Sure. And maybe I'll just go back to the first comment too about
Yeah.
work. And I think, what was really fun for the work that we did for you guys is that cut both ways, in that the very early discussions with Kurt, he was very upfront with, he wanted us to be able to stand behind the analysis and wanted to see what the numbers in the analysis showed, whether that was pro dams or not. He wanted just some good analysis that we could stand behind. So it was really great to work with you guys in that regards as well, because I think the intent of both firms were really well aligned.
Absolutely.
So then on the production cost model side, so it's an optimization model is kind of at its core. And what it's trying to do is, given a set of electricity demand that you have to meet, or you're going to have blackouts, it tries to optimize what the best way to meet that demand is, given the current supply or generators that you have on your grid. And it tries to optimize that subject to a variety of constraints. So the constraints may be that the physical constraints, like transmission constraints, and other physical constraints could be operating characteristics of the actual generators themselves. So for hydro plants, what the actual monthly hydro flows may be, and how much hour to hour that hydro facility could ramp up its output or ramp down its output. And then also subject to constraints such as policy, long-term kind of policy constraints. So these are like the clean energy laws that we have that are mandating 100% renewable by a certain date, or a certain amount of carbon emissions by a certain date. So the model is taking into consideration those type of policy constraints. And what it's trying to optimize to is the least cost solution. So it's trying to find the cheapest way to supply power with the given generators you have, subject to a variety of physical constraints like transmission constraints and policy constraints such as clean energy laws. And the model is used for a variety of time scales. So at its core, it's an hourly dispatch model. So every hour it goes through that problem where it tries to find the optimal solution to meet demand given supply. But it also goes out several decades. So for the study for the Northwest RiverPartners, we ran it out to 2045, which is when most of these clean energy laws come into hit their kind of most stringent 100% level. And when you get out that far, the model has to make decisions on generators to retire and generators to add. And that component of the model is called a long-term capacity expansion. And in terms of that, it's still solving the same problem, where it's still trying to optimize how to meet the demand given the supply you have, but you also give it a set of candidate generators that it can add to the system. So these are new wind farms and their location and their cost and their output curves, new solar farms and battery storage units. So the model can try to figure out what the optimal future grid is going to look like to both maintain reliability, meet the power demand, as well as meet the clean energy laws.
And I would imagine too that it might not be. I wouldn't say tricky is the right word, but I would assume that from both a policy and a technology standpoint, that frequently updating that model is probably something that is very important to maintaining that work and just from one year to the next, maybe you might see potentially different results.
Yeah, I would say yes and no. So the certainly some things that you update the model with could drastically change the results. So for one example of that is if you thought that small nuclear reactors were going to be available by 2030 at a reasonable financial cost, that type of assumption could dramatically change the capacity mix that the model comes up with in 2045. Um, Another big driver would be the demand, the electricity demand that you're putting on the model. If um, let's say a utility came out and they were projecting a 1% load growth over the next 10 years, and then they said, well, actually, we're seeing a lot more air conditioners come online, so we're going to increase that to 1.5% annually for the next 10 years, those could be pretty big drivers to the model results. Um, some other parameters, the model tends not to be too sensitive to, so updating them really frequent isn't as big a deal. For example, if we get a new wind farm come online that maybe has a 200 megawatt capacity to it, it's important to add that on to capture the price dynamics in the near term. But if we're talking about a long-term capacity expansion model that's adding hundreds of gigawatts of capacity, maybe capturing that might not be as important. It wouldn't really swing results one way or the other, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, no, it definitely does. Um, so moving on a little bit into some of our work specifically with you, we've commissioned two studies now with Energy GPS, one in 2019 and then again in 2022, which is the one we've primarily discussed thus far. That work was incredibly useful from our perspective. But were there any takeaways or insights on your end of things that you came away with after either of those? Anything particularly that really stood out in conducting that work?
Yeah, so I think one thing, so lots of things. I think one thing was it was a very challenging project in the sense that trying to simulate 100% clean energy grid is very challenging. And if you kind of go back to my original days getting into modeling, where I described the computational fluid dynamics as a virtual wind tunnel, well, the production cost model is kind of like a virtual power grid, and we're simulating all of the same dynamics or most of the same dynamics that you would on a power grid. And we had a really hard time getting the model to be able to maintain grid reliability at those high levels of clean energy, at those 100% levels across the Western US to meet a lot of these state policies, like the state policy in California, Washington, and Oregon to be specific. Um, and so that was one of the things and Kurt had this takeaway that he would use, saying, the model had a really hard time solving that problem. And we're going to have a really hard time solving that problem in real life when we get to those levels. And I think that was one takeaway that was powerful for me, is that these clean energy laws are very ambitious, and solving that problem with the current technology that we have is going to be very, very difficult. Um, And then another takeaway was just the amount of capacity that we found and that others found that you have to add to the system to maintain grid reliability. So what I mean by grid reliability is to avoid blackouts. Um, and meet the clean energy laws is enormous. And at the pace that we're adding renewables right now, we don't have any shot to meet the clean energy laws. And that fell out of the study, which was important. And both of those points were independent of what we were looking at on removing the lower Snake River dams. Both of those were, even if you leave the lower Snake River dams in, it's going to be very hard to meet the clean energy laws. We're going to have to add a lot of capacity. Grid reliability is going to be hard to maintain. And the timing of that is going to be really hard unless we have huge breakthroughs in either technology or the pace at which we can add renewables to the system.
Right, right. And that's something, as we get into this further, definitely going to be touching on a lot more. I do want to go back and quote specifically as far as talking about the capacity portion of things. That study that you guys conducted, it showed that it would take roughly about 15,000 megawatts of new solar, wind, and battery backup to replace the current 3,000 megawatts of peak capacity provided by the lower Snake River dams. What is it about those dams, the lower Snake River dams, that makes them so difficult to replace?
So it really comes down to a concept called effective load carrying capability. So how much that you can count on the generator during the highest peak net load periods. So your highest load periods that are after wind and solar, and those are the times where you could potentially have blackouts or grid reliability issues. And in the case of the hydro facilities, they historically they can provide like around maybe 60% of their 65% of their capacity during those critical peak hour needs. Some of them can flex up to 80% is what we've seen in the data. And that's how they've historically performed during these highest load hours where you really need it. If you remove those and you only have wind or solar or batteries as an option to replace those assets don't perform nearly as well as the lower Snake River dams. And one thing that complicates that is if you look at it in terms of 100% clean energy world, where you have to add a tremendous amount of wind, solar, and batteries to the system, those assets perform even worse as you add more and more of them to the system. So in the case of solar, as you add more and more solar to the system, you're getting a lot more generation than you need in the middle of the day and when the sun's shining. But towards the afternoon, that generation starts tapering off, and that's when you need it the most. And so even though you add more and more to it, you're actually getting a lower and lower benefit of that to your peak net load hours, so the hours of need. It both shifts back the hour in which you really need generation, and as it shifts it back, it's when it performs the worst. So you see studies that are estimating in these future scenarios where a solar may only provide 3% or 5% of its capacity to maintain reliability during those highest peak net load hours. Whereas the lower Snake River dams, as I mentioned, people assume anywhere between 60 to 80%. And the same is true for batteries. As you add more and more batteries, their ability to perform at the critical hours of needs is diminished as you add more and more of them, because they actually flatten out the net load hours. So it's a little trickier to try to understand this one. But if you have 1 hour where you really need generation, you can add a 4-hour battery and it'll perform during that full hour. But as you add more and more of them, that 1 hour becomes 2 hours, and eventually becomes, say, like 5 hours. And that's what the Western Power Pool is seeing, is that the average need for batteries to perform is about 5 hours. So a 4 hour battery could only provide that need 80% of the time, or 4 out of 5 hours. And when we get to these 100% clean energy environments, that increases, that duration increases more and more. And you see estimates where batteries may only provide 30% or 10% of their peak load, or of their capacity during the peak load times. And that there's a lot of uncertainty with batteries, and some of the estimates have jumped around wildly from 80% down to 10%. So, but I think what is known is that their capacity contribution in these 100% clean energy futures is going to be substantially less than what the lower Snake river dams can provide. So that's the main driver of why you can't just replace the 3,000 megawatts with 3,000 megawatts. You have to have more capacity than that, or alternative technology. I'm sorry, that was a poor choice of words. Technology that's not yet commercially available. So something like small nuclear reactors potentially.
And it's interesting too, because it does seem like there's a bit of a common theme, speaking more broadly on the issue, that when it comes to the lower Snake River dams, there's kind of what we know and then what we don't know, and the unknowns. Talking about, for example, the batteries having that range of 10 to 80%. There's a pretty wide gap there where there's a lot of variability, and you almost, in some ways, you can try to predict it, but you don't really know until it's implemented. So it's definitely something that comes up a lot in that conversation, is understanding that. One thing I did want to ask, just for clarification, really for our listeners, could you describe that peak load, those peak load hours? What is that peak load event that you're speaking of, and what might lead you to running up against that really that high end threshold of load demand?
Yeah, so load's driven a lot by weather, as well as the consumer demand for the time of day. So what's driving the timing of the peak load events, or at least the seasonal timing of those, is either in the winter time when it's really cold and you have a lot of heating demand, or in the summertime when it's really hot and you have a lot of demand for air conditioning. And then the timing of that is in the evening when people are home. So that's what really drives the timing of it, when power is consumed the most. So what you see when the typical hourly load shape that you see a peak in the early morning, kind of before people go to work, and then it drops off during middle day, and then peaks back up in the afternoon into the evening when people are home. And that, when you couple that with the output from renewable generation, you can see the net peak load hour even driving the net peak load driving further in the evening, because you have a lot of solar in the middle of the day, and then that tapers off in the afternoon periods. So that kind of the classic example of this is the California duck curve, where they showed that the net load shape looks like a duck as you add more and more solar to the system, so that during the middle of the day, then the net load drops way down because you have a lot of solar generation. But then in the evening, so that's kind of the belly of the duck, and then in the evening it increases greater than it would before, and that's kind of the head of the duck.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I think like I said, for our listeners particularly, that extra context will be really helpful in kind of understanding what we're talking about. Going back to another point you made, after that 2022 study, a key point that came up, as you mentioned, is that even if we don't remove the lower Snake River dams, and certainly we hope that doesn't happen, there's still a significant hurdle in building out enough carbon-free resources at a reasonable pace. And some of the goals that have been set are looking like they're potentially not attainable. I've been speaking to some of our other guests on the podcast about the newer technologies, your small modular nuclear, hydrogen, etc. And they've noted that there's both optimism and concern about how we're going to reach this clean energy future that's being discussed. So maybe from your perspective, as we speak today, what is your outlook on where we're headed and what the challenges are moving ahead?
I think that the biggest challenge that I see moving forward is that given the historical and even last year's amount of renewables that we've added to the grid, at those paces we fall way short of what we're forecasting needs to be added to the grid if we're just adding current commercially available technologies. So kind of to put numbers around that, we show you need 160 gigawatts of wind, solar, and battery to meet by 2045 to meet the clean energy laws in the region. And that's with the Lower Snake River Dam. And then that jumps up to about 175 if you remove the Lower Snake River dams. So the amount of annual additions to meet that would be about 7,600 megawatts every year to be able that's the pace of additions you have to hit to be able to hit that 175 gigawatts. What has been done, and all these numbers are in the Western Power Pool. So on average, what we see is about 1,500 megawatts. Last year, there was 1,800 megawatts added. And the maximum of the last 3 years was 3,600 megawatts. So we need to more than double the max that has occurred in the last 3 years, but we have to do that every year, year over year. And as we do that, it just gets harder and harder to find good sites. The transmission requirements for those sites is going to become greater and greater. And we just don't see a clear path to be able to hit those numbers. It just seems like we're starting out, we're underperforming to those. And supply chain issues and everything we hear from the market is it's just getting harder and harder to build these sites and not easier. So I think that's the one thing that would concern me about hitting these goals is we're not off to a good start and we need something pretty dramatic to happen. And I think what that dramatic thing to happen would be new technologies or the policies to change. Maybe we try to get to an 80% clean future instead of 100% clean future, and that would be a lot easier to meet than these 100% clean futures.
And something else too that I think is worth discussing is, primarily what we're discussing is the actual build out side of things and the work towards getting to 100% clean or like you said, even trying to get to at least 80% clean. But there is the other side of it, which is the challenges around grid reliability, increased load, or increased demand, and also too some of the climate change challenges that we've seen. People here in the Northwest might be familiar with some of the heat dome events that we've had the last few years, and certainly if you were here 2 years ago, you probably remember when it was 118 degrees outside for almost 3 days straight. So there's also that side of it too to consider. And do you see any concerns with grid reliability moving forward, and what possible solutions might be available to us, and also how does that how does the grid reliability question factor into maybe adjusting our sites or trying to consider a different pace in how we move towards getting to that clean energy build out?
Sure. Yeah, I think on the grid reliability side, I think we're seeing that play out right now, and we have seen that play out, like you mentioned, with the heat dome issues and the California blackouts. We're seeing higher load demand than what we've seen historically and what's been forecasted by utilities. And a lot of that comes in the form of air conditioners that are being added, these split units that are being added. And Jeff has the saying where if you add an air conditioner to your house, he doesn't know anybody that wouldn't turn it on when the temperature gets above 75 in their house. And I think that's pretty true. We added some to our house, and that is true. Once you add it, you're going to use it. And so we see at the same temperature bands, we see higher load due to those kind of structural demand changes. And that's going to continue to grow in the clean energy laws in like the Washington Cap and Invest program and CETA. Their playbook is to move energy demand from transportation to the electricity sector in the form of electric vehicles, and to move demand from residential, commercial, and industrial processes from fossil fuels to the electricity sector through things like electric heat pumps. And we're just going to see this greater and greater burden on the electricity sector. And all indications is that it's not up to that challenge right now, at least to meet the power in a green fashion. So just this year, the first quarter this year, we're in a hydro year that we're forecasting at Energy GPS to be about 80% of normal, as measured at the Dalles. And we're seeing that put a big strain on the grid. We're seeing mid-C clear at prices well above those in California, and needing to keep that power at home. We're seeing gas burns in the state of Washington and Oregon that are well above anything that's occurred in the last 3 years, and that's all driven by this low water year. So as we move more and more demand to the electricity sector, we could be seeing grid reliability events when we have things like a low water year or higher electricity demand due to heat dome events. But even without heat dome events, we're seeing more and more stress being put on the electricity sector, and renewable additions that aren't on pace to make up for that stress.
And that speaks a lot to some of the concerns that we have seen from even people in the general public that are concerned not only about climate change, but also how drought and low water is going to impact even hydropower, and hydropower being something that we talk about as a really important resource. My understanding is that in general, our region isn't necessarily predicting to see less water come through, but that the timing of that water is going to change. But, also there are going to be times like what we're seeing now where we're not getting maybe the snowpack that we need, and we're not getting the water supply for, the year ahead. So, maybe you can speak to, through your lens as someone working on the research and analytics side of things, a perspective you could share on the forecast for drought and low water and climate change's impact moving forward, and what we might expect for our hydro system.
Yeah, I'm not as up to date on that as I should be, and there's been some work done in the region on that, kind of forecasting out what that would look like from these climate models. But from my understanding, that it may be a little dated, but what we're going to see is similar amounts of precipitation, but more rain and less snow. And so, like you said, that's going to change the timing of the water runoff and spring runoff in the hydro generation. But I think kind of putting that aside because of my lack of kind of current up-to-date knowledge on that, I think the other thing we see on the hydro side is any kind of new policy that comes out are putting more requirements, more constraints on the dam operations than fewer. So we see proposals for additional spill requirements that would lower the amount of generation coming out of these dams and lower their ability to maybe flex up or down. I don't think we've ever seen anything come out that it's giving them more freedom to operate. It's always more and more constrained operation. And so I think that'll be the challenge um, as we move forward in the years and decades to come, is just that system, even if it has the same amount of water availability, its availability to run that through the generators may be diminished through other policies that come out.
Certainly. And one other question that comes up too is, climate change being such an important factor in this discussion and where we see things moving. How do you model climate change when you're doing a broader modeling of the grid? How do you work climate change into that equation to make sure that you're accounting for where we expect to be heading?
Yeah, so I think the one way that you could do that, so the model, so some of the key inputs of the model are both the annual energy demand that you need, as well as the peak demand that you need at that peak hour. And then the hourly shape, or what we call the 8760, because there's 8,760 hours in a normal non-leap year. Um, so we put those inputs in the model, and those parameters can change as we look at a future environment. And let's see, I think it was Puget Sound Energy during their current IRP, their integrated resource plan that they're working on right now. They had derived those assumptions using kind of the typical approaches of taking historical values or historical shapes and trying to derive a normal hourly profile of load and kind of normal load forecast. Then I believe they used outputs from a climate model to inform that, as well as to inform, I believe, their wind, maybe their hydro. I can't remember, but that's how they incorporated that into their forecast. And I think they saw some dramatic changes in the forecast by doing that. There's a lot of uncertainty in using climate-derived outputs to model, to inform inputs to a production cost model. So what we've done is we've stuck with using historical approaches, and projected load growth kind of as a normal business as usual case. And for our particular study for you guys, we did the business as usual load growth, not even including electrification. So if anything, our estimates for power capacity to replace the lower Snake River dams and to meet these clean energy goals would be on the low side if you added increased load due to the electrification or any kind of extreme events from say a climate model into it. It would just make it harder to maintain grid reliability and to meet these goals and not easier.
Certainly, and that's something else too that I wanted to discuss, and I'm glad you brought it up. Is there is the policy around, say, transitioning to clean energy, but then there's also that electrification policy. I believe we've heard from states like Oregon and Washington that they're expecting the demand for electricity to basically double by 2050 due to the combination of electric vehicles and shifting away from natural gas for things like heating in the home. Are those numbers consistent with what you're seeing?
Yeah, I believe so. It's always tricky because you need to figure out what year they're talking about and get everything to apples. But those do seem consistent with what I've been seeing. We've based our electrification scenarios that we've done for other work based on reports from the state of Washington, where they have a pretty nice report that shows the demand growth as expected in transportation, residential, commercial, and industrial, and then electricity kind of for a reference case. And then they show a case if you electrified the other sectors, so the transportation and residential, commercial, and industry sectors. And it does put quite a bit of a burden on the electricity sector. So I think we're talking annual growth rates Right now around 1.2%, and maybe up to 3% under a electrification scenario. So huge annual demand increases. What's less certain is the peak load demand. So that's not expected to grow at the same rate as the baseline energy, because things like electric vehicles can be charged at off high electric demand times. But that's kind of where the big uncertainty raises is how high that peak load is going to increase in these electrification scenarios.
Right, right. One interesting follow-up question that comes to mind here too is you mentioned that, for our study, for example, you took maybe a bit more of a modest approach in modeling some of that. Could you speak to, I guess, the decision to, say, hey, we're gonna take a more aggressive look at it versus, maybe just look at it from a very base level and kind of assume that maybe there's not quite as much of an aggressive ramp up in demand. What factors into making those decisions in your work?
Yeah, we wanted to get a good baseline study out there. We wanted it to stand up to criticism from either side. And so kind of every step of the way that we went, if there was a decision to be made on the input assumptions, we kind of took a middle of the road approach. So for example, the load growth that we talked about, we were using more of a business as usual load growth and didn't try to simulate an electrification scenario. Another study that was done by E3 looked at an electrification scenario. Um, and then a study that was done by Energy Strategies didn't look at any kind of future scenario. They just used historical load to look at what it would take to replace the lower Snake River dams. So we felt we were in a good kind of middle of the road approach, and weren't trying to stick our necks out for what we thought electrification would bring to the load side. Another assumption is around how much peaking capacity the lower Snake River dams could actually provide. As I mentioned, you could take that range is kind of 60 to 80%, say, or 85%. We stuck to the lower end of that. I believe we used like a 66% peaking capacity for the study. Where E3, so that came out to be a little bit more than 1,800 megawatts of peaking capacity that would need to be replaced. The E3 study gave a little bit more generous weight to that and was 2,300 megawatts, whereas this other energy strategy report came out with 1,000 megawatts. And those numbers came out kind of after our study, or at the same time we were all publishing the results. So it wasn't that we decided to go with the middle ground between the two or anything. It just came to be that through our process of wanting to come up with a really credible study, that we came up with inputs that were more on the middle of ground and couldn't be really criticized from either side, either a pro dam side or a pro fish side that was saying we took one side or another. It's pretty straight down the road.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and that's really important because ultimately, as a pro dam organization, obviously that's the result that we would be maybe hoping for is something that does speak to the value of the dams, right? But even if that weren't the case, we do want something ultimately objective, and at the end of the day, we want to be guided by facts as opposed to bias. So, it's something that we appreciate in the process and in working with you. One thing that I do want to ask you about is maybe you could touch on why there is a bit of discrepancy over that peak load when analyzing the lower Snake River dams, particularly. And questions that come up for me are like, is it because it's a run of the river dam as opposed to a storage dam? Grand Coulee, for folks listening, being an example of storage where you have a reservoir and you're able to utilize that to store and release water, where our lower Snake River dams and also our lower Columbia dams and others are run of the river, meaning that there isn't truly a reservoir. It's just that the water is backed up to a certain extent behind. Is it stuff like that? Is it more policy driven? Whereas the what the dam operators are allowed to do with the dams dictates how much generation is available. I guess maybe help me and our listeners understand and break down why there's not maybe a clear cut answer on that peak capacity question.
Yeah, so I think it's both in terms of the dynamics of different water years. So if you have a lot of water available or not, and it just kind of as a baseline, and then it's a function of how you can operate the individual dams and what you can flex up to be. And kind of the rule of thumb is, or not the rule of thumb, but the assumption here is the amount that you can generate for an hour period. So you need to be able to flex up and hold it for that hour long period. And one of the nice things about working here at Energy GPS is that we've developed the hourly hydro model, and we've been tracking the hydro dams in the Pacific Northwest for, I think, well, I can't remember what our data set goes back to. I think I cut it off. Well, I think it actually goes back quite a ways. But on the hourly side, I think I did this analysis back to 2000, where I looked at the hourly hydro generation for the Pacific Northwest fleet from 2000 till now, and looked at what it generated, the max that fleet generated during the peak load hours. And it ranged quite a bit depending on the water year, but it did come in to be around that 60%. So it's impacted by the water year itself, and then just what the dam can operate at. But it's really interesting in that moving forward, there's some people that think that will change. So the Western Power Pool has come out with this Western Resource Adequacy Program, and it's a capacity program across the West that's really trying to improve grid reliability across the West at a lower cost. And one of the things that they need to do this is to try to accredit the hydro generators, or to determine this amount of peaking capacity from the hydro generators. And for their analysis, what they did is they developed this hydro model, and they put all of the historical hydro generation in there. I think they went back 10 years. And then they also put all the current understanding of the operational characteristics of the dam. And they come out with this ability for the dams to kind of on average to flex up to around 76%. So well above what we see historically. And the big driver for that is what they think is that when you're operating under this kind of regional capacity program, that if the dams get a signal that they need to generate more, they'll be able to ramp up and generate more in times of need as compared to what they have done historically. So that's kind of why it's still an open question. Maybe just to try to summarize, is that historically we don't see them performing at very high levels, but future-looking models and industry experts believe that they will be able to operate like that. And the actual operators of the dams in those programs in the RAP program, have to sign off on their capacity credits. So they're kind of signing up for being able to ramp up to those levels if they see a signal that needs it.
And just looking at this, maybe to kind of put an end cap on this topic before we kind of wind down on some other questions here. Just broadly speaking, when it comes to climate change, the clean energy transition, what role do you see hydropower playing in that bigger picture, and how important is it to ensure that those resources are able to be utilized to their fullest potential?
Yeah, I think we're pretty lucky in the Pacific Northwest that we have this generation fleet that is renewable and carbon free. And so I think they play a critical role in our ability to get to these 100% clean energy goals or even higher. Or even less stringent goals. I mean, they just provide a fundamental backbone to get to these clean energy um, goals. But kind of with that said, there are grids all over the world that operate without such a large amount of hydro. And so I don't think I would go as far as to say that we have to have the dams to become carbon neutral and have a grid reliable grid. But they certainly set us up for a lot more success than not.
Well said. Very well said. Moving forward here, one other thing that I did want to touch on is that Energy GPS has been also tackling other regional issues. One of them being Washington State's carbon market. And as I understand it, the first auction was just completed on that. What are some lessons that you've learned there from looking at that first auction and the implications that it has on our decarbonization efforts?
Yeah, so we've been working on the Washington Carbon for a while now, and one of the kind of the first things we did is we wanted to try to develop a fundamental forecast of carbon emissions in the state of Washington from each of the major sectors. And so we were able to do that. We took the Washington State greenhouse gas inventory that was available up through, I think, 2018 at the time, and now 2019. It's kind of lagged. We took that and it breaks the carbon emissions into three main sectors: the electricity sector, transportation, and residential, commercial, and industrial. Yeah, we started with that, and then we developed methods to be able to forecast that out through the first compliance period. So the first compliance period is 2023 through 2026. And we had a variety of methods for each of the sectors, probably most comfortable with the electricity sector because we leveraged our production cost model to be able to forecast out emissions from that sector. And what we saw early on before the auction, even before the auction was held, is that we thought that there was going to be more carbon emissions, way more carbon emissions than the declining cap through this kind of a business as usual carbon forecast. The cap in 2023 declines down to 63 million metric tons, and we're forecasting to be around 72 million metric tons from these three sectors in 2023. We don't see a clear way that the state's going to reduce the carbon emissions, especially for 2023 with the low hydro year. We're seeing, as I mentioned before, we're seeing record natural gas burns and more emissions from natural gas plants within the state than we've had before in the last 3 years. We're seeing more imports coming into the state to try to make up for the lost hydro, and those will be accounted at an unspecified emission rate, most likely. That's on the electricity side. On the residential, commercial, and industrial side, those consumptions and emission are really for heating type of processes. So we don't see a huge shift in that, at least for this first year in 2023. That's kind of more of a long term as you mandate that new construction needs electric heat pumps instead of natural gas furnaces. You'll see a drop in those, but we don't see any kind of radical shift this year. And the same for the transportation sector. To decarbonize that, it's going to require new electric vehicles, and that's going to be more of a longer term strategy than this year. So everything that we saw is that emissions are going to exceed the cap, and we were pretty bullish the carbon allowance price. And when it cleared, it kind of confirmed that. It came in at $48.50, which the floor price was set at $22 and change. So it's well above the floor price, and the ceiling price is at about $82. To put it kind of in context with the California carbon market, that market is trading at about $30 right now. So the Washington program came in well above that. And all indications is that, at least for this first year and kind of for the first compliance period, we see that there's a lot of reasons to believe that that high price will continue and maybe even increase. To drive, kind of putting it into context, to drive behavior, it doesn't translate into that high of increase in gas price to drive transportation behavior. Maybe like a 40-60 cent increase in gas prices. I have to go back and review our work on that. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it wasn't anything where we thought it would really drive behavior to drive fewer miles. But it is making a pretty big impact on the electricity sector. We're seeing mid-C prices that are well above the California market. I think today was today or yesterday was the first day that mid-C traded below the California market for the most part of this year. So what that's telling us is that we're seeing high energy prices and driven by this low hydro year that we need to keep burning these natural gas. We need to keep burning natural gas to meet power demand in the region. And that even with a high carbon price, we don't see the electricity sector changing its behavior, just because there's nowhere else to go in this type of low water year.
It does seem that there's maybe a common thread here, which is, interesting to note that the pacing of this, as well as the pacing issues we talked about with some of that clean energy build out earlier, maybe is less attainable than one might hope. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's my feeling on it. And we see that from other states as well. So in California, the nuclear plant Diablo Canyon was supposed to be retired, and that was a big policy initiative was to retire that. And then they got kind of hit in the face with the realities of grid reliability challenges and not having enough power to meet demand. And so they kind of changed their tune on that and have extended the lifetime of that unit or are trying to work through that process now. And I think we may see the same in the state of Washington, is that as this market unfolds and if the sectors don't respond or can't respond in time to the cap and invest program, that we may need to see some policy changes to get something that's more realistic.
Thank you. I appreciate that perspective. As we wind down here, what takeaways do you hope that the listeners of this podcast are going to come away with after listening today? Are there any particular messages that you'd like to share on this topic?
The first big takeaway is that these clean energy laws are going to be very, very hard to meet. We have a grand challenge in front of us. I don't want to come across like I'm anti clean energy. I'm pro clean energy and pro getting away from fossil fuels, but doing it in a smart way that doesn't hamper grid reliability or dramatically increase costs. And so I think that's kind of the first takeaway, is that we have a huge challenge in front of us to get to these goals. And I guess I call them goals, but they really are clean energy laws because they've been passed. And that as we at Energy GPS are tracking these markets very, very closely. And as this unfolds, we have a variety of dashboards to look at these kind of in a real-time sense, or in the Washington Carbon world, we're updating our forecasts monthly. And so we're staying on top of it and seeing where the market goes.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense to me, and I hope it makes a lot more sense to the folks listening as well. Given the really good discussion that we've had today on the topic and on understanding, the bigger picture here. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the time today. And as we close out, I do have one last thing that I have to run by you. Have you ever listened to an episode of Damn before?
I have. I listened to the first episode with Kurt, and then a little on the last one, episode 4, on the hydrogen stuff.
Okay. So you may know what's coming next. For those that haven't listened to an episode of Dan before, I like to do this little thing at the end here to help you guys get to know the person that we're talking to today, and to understand not only the topic that we've had and all that, but it's also a bit of a nice palate cleanser as we conclude, to get out of some of the real in-depth conversation and put a nice cap on things. So with that being said, could you maybe provide a piece of advice for the people that are listening at home? And it doesn't have to be advice about anything that we've talked about today. It could just be general good life advice. But what's a good parting word that you'd want to leave people with, and something that people can take away and have kind of a nice positive note to end on here?
Yeah. So I think the word would be integrity. That integrity touches everything we do, both in our personal and professional life. And I think you need to have high integrity in both at the highest level, and you can lose it so easily. Just one misstep, and you can lose someone's trust, and you can never gain that trust again in a lot of cases. And so I think that both me personally and at Energy GPS, we believe in the highest integrity possible in all of our work, and leading to great analysis. And I think that's what really sets us apart. So that's what I'd leave you with.
Well, I can certainly speak for myself and Kurt that we sincerely appreciate your integrity, and we appreciate the integrity of Energy GPS and the work that you guys have done. So yeah, it goes a long way, and I hope that after people have listened today, that they'll appreciate it just as much. But yeah, with that being said, I think we had a really good one. I think we covered just about everything that I can think of. So with that being said, I'll let you get after it and enjoy the rest of this afternoon. And hopefully, I'm looking outside right now. It's pretty sunny here. I hope you're getting some nice springtime weather over there as well.
Yeah, we absolutely are. Yeah, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate being on, and it's been really fun. So look forward to hopefully working with you guys again in the future.
Absolutely. And if that's the case, maybe we'll have another guest appearance here from you in some of the future work that we do.
Sounds great.
All right. Thank you. All right. I'm going to keep this outro short and sweet, as I'm currently a bit under the weather as of recording this episode. But you guys know the saying, the show must go on. And today, what a good show it was. Now, if you enjoyed this one and you haven't heard the previous episodes of Damn, I encourage you to go back and listen to those first. After you've done so, you can subscribe to the podcast on your favorite listening platform so you're notified when new episodes arrive. And while you're there, you can also let us know just how much you're enjoying Damn by leaving a positive review. Now, for those that haven't subscribed and need a reminder, new episodes of Damn are going to be coming out every other Friday. So that means we'll be back with more in 2 weeks from the time of this one releasing. Until then, go find us on social media at NW RiverPartners and check out our website at nwriverpartners.org. And with that, I think that's just about enough for me on this one. It is definitely time for me to go rest up. So until next time, see ya!